Now we're going to move on to the other filters that I add to my voiceovers, which is going to be a hard limiter. I'm going to double click to add it on. Now, what this hard limiter is going to do, you can see an input boost and a maximum amplitude. Maximum amplitude. So the input boost is going to boost the input of the sound, aka bring up the decibels, bring up the volume. And the maximum amplitude is going to create a ceiling that's not going to let you go above. The reason I like to do this is if I set this to -3 and then I boost this up, let's say 4 points, 4 decibels, it's going to boost. You can see with any audio, you have a waveform and there's peaks. This stops the peak from going too high where it gets distorted. And then the boost is going to boost all these lower regions that aren't quite as high as these higher regions to make parts where you speak a little bit quieter. It's going to boost those up so that all of your voiceover has a very much more unified actual volume. But then it also, I've noticed, adds a more presence of voice because everything that you're saying is kind of not at max volume, but at a very boosted volume. So it can be good for people who speak quieter. It can be good for really anything. But I've just noticed with voiceovers, it does a lot. More depth of field, more narrow of a frame, but a little bit more of a documentary feel. So as you can see, it's bringing up the sound of all my different parts of my words. Parts when I go quieter, parts when I'm louder are not going too loud. And the difference between doing something like a hard limiter, which is also called a compressor, it might be called a compressor in your editing software, is that if I bring up the volume, that's going to bring up the volume of everything and things will start clipping. And boom, here's. But if I use the hard limiter, it's going to boost everything but put a ceiling so it doesn't go too high, which keeps the high parts not too high and then boost the low parts. Make sense? Okay. That's how it looks at 50 mil. Next, what I do is add a mastering filter. It could be called different things in your editing software, but what this is going to do is do a final pass on boosting and widening and what's called adding an exciter, which kind of boosts the highs as well, to your voice. So my favorite filter to use is this bright hype filter. What I'm going to do is take off the reverb. We never want to add reverb to a voiceover. You really always want to remove it. So there are some situations where if you do a lot of sound processing on your audio and you're removing sounds and you're removing hums in the background and removing buzzes in the background, it can make your audio sound a little bit too polished and kind of computery. And when you add reverb back, it kind of makes it more spacey. It adds more like space between the words, but we don't need to worry about that. That's very specific. So we're not going to be adding any reverb to our audio today, but we're going to take away that. We're going to take away the loudness maximizer. We're already doing that with the hard limiter. And let's take a listen to what this sounds like. Oh, this is a great focal length for documentaries and short films, but we really lose. So you can see it adds even more of that kind of interesting, there's more of a electricity to my voice. So let's take a listen. Use the feeling of the background and it doesn't feel as much that we're. Now let's remove these filters. Focal length for documentaries and short films, but we really lose the feeling of the background and it doesn't feel as much that we're sitting with the person on camera. That's a huge difference. Let's hear that one more time. Lose the feeling of the background and it doesn't feel as much that we're sitting with the person on camera. Whew. Okay, that's why I had to stop in the middle of my phase of pulling these selects for the rough edit and fix the audio. So you could also see as I was playing this and that it is redlining just slightly. It is redlining just slightly over here. So the way to combat that, because we had everything at a pretty good level, but when we put on this mastering final layer of our filter that brought up the highs even more, what that did was increase the overall decibels. So we need to go to our hard limiter and bring down the maximum amplitude, let's say 2 decibels to -5. In short films, but we really lose the feeling of the background, and now our audio is coming in right above -6, which is perfect. That's going to leave room for music in the background, sound effects in the background, and that's really the benchmark that I go for with all videos that I've done. So that should give you a really good understanding of how you can use your filters. They might have different names in your editing software, so take the time to Google it, do a little bit of research on how you can find how to do a compressor to boost your footage to boost your audio, and also add a ceiling so it doesn't clip, and then also a mastering filter so that you can increase the highs, and something similar to a parametric equalizer filter like this so that you can see what's going on in your audio. So as I'm going through, and you can see we're kind of speeding through this process of taking all the selects that we've made, and now I'm cutting it and syncing it up to different words and different sentences of my voiceover. This process can be a little bit tedious, but really the takeaway here is that we're using the important clips that we set aside for our edit, and we're simply scrunching everything down into a much faster pace montage, similar to what we did with the opening the boxes sequence in a previous learning lesson. But instead of doing that to the sound in the clips, we're doing it to the sound of the voiceover. And now that the edit is at a pretty good place, I just want to kind of play through a couple parts here. Now we got it down to 10 minutes, just over 10 minutes. So I'm going to skip through and just kind of play a few parts so you can get a feel for what the visuals are looking like, for what the voiceover is sounding like. And then we're going to go in and start adding our layer of music and a few other refining tips. So I'm going to skip ahead to, let's say, and that leads us to the Christmas phase. This is going to be where you're at your peak of overwhelm during this process, because you're going to end up with a bunch of packages at your house when you don't even really remember what you ordered, but there's just a bunch of boxes. So I use this overwhelm to create a cool little montage with a really pointy object. And after putting any band-aids on. So that's kind of how our montage cut together. We were able to use it at a specific part that made total sense for the video. So let's continue to play it through. And after putting any band-aids on from minor cuts and scratches from that last montage, now it is time for our initial test shots and setup phase. So what you want to do is grab your most important equipment. Mine's going to be my key light, my main lighting source, my camera, my desk, and my chair. And I'm going to kind of move things around in my studio to find out what's going to be the best location in the backdrop. So you can continue to move things around, wave your hands around, do a little bit of a dance. And after all that testing, just move things back to where you figured they were going to be in the first place. But now that we've done that, we have our setup ready to go, and all we have to worry about in the future is sitting down and hitting record, because we know we're maximizing our space because we did these test shots, and now that we've done that, it's time to second guess all the decisions we made up to this point. So you can see that there's cutting at big moments of what's happening in the voiceover. So you can kind of read the audio here that you can almost see just from looking at how this looks right here that there might be a cut there, and there is. And then this is a big peak. So these are intonations, these are changes in speech, these are new sentences, these are changes in thought. and me making different points. And that just kind of happens to line up with when the volume of someone's voice might change. So that's something to keep an eye on and something to keep in mind when you're deciding when should I make a cut, when should I edit, when should I change my shot. That's something to keep in mind. These cuts are literally matching up with the specific kind of packets of speech that I have. These two line up with this sentence. Let's see what it was. So you can continue to move things around, wave your hands around, do a little bit of a dance. Right? So I'm always showing what the vocals are saying. That might be obvious to you, but it may not. It's really kind of so obvious that it's not obvious. I see a lot of people who create videos, they're not showing things that the music or the vocals are telling what should be shown. They're speaking about something, but they're showing something else. So it's almost so obvious that it's maybe overlooked. I'm not quite sure why not many people do it. And if we kind of skip forward, let's just look at maybe one more example before we get into updating the audio. But we don't have a whole lot of time for that because now it is our building process. This is where we get to lift things, mark some things, drill some things, use a cool laser thing. And ideally, by the end of this process, we've hung these things on the wall and they are staying on the wall. And voila, there we go. Now we have our shelves in the background, and I'm going to put some lights on in the background to see how things are starting to come together, which leads us to our painting and styling phase. So you can kind of see how these chapters, they're changing. And so what's going to be taught in each one of these little mini chapters of this 10-minute video is going to be likely possibly a new song. So we're going to get into some tips here and some techniques around using multiple tracks, which I set aside some already that we'll go through together. These are going to create a 10-minute video that really feels more like a 4 or 5-minute video because we're going to change the music so often. It's really going to make a brand new start and a beginning to our video. But let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. And let's first get into a technique on how to use reverb in a strategic way in the next learning lesson. Awesome. So let's play our intro of our video, and we're going to find this moment, actually 2 moments, where we're going to use reverb and possibly a little bit of changing pitch of some of our audio to create a cool effect. Man, I know this doesn't look like much. I know it doesn't sound like much, but I'm going to show you how I went from taking this studio space like this and made it look like this. Yep, I got a lot of work to do. And booms. And then it'll go into probably we'll put our first music track right here because this is when we're actually starting the video. But what I want to do here is kind of amp up these 2 snaps. That and this. And the coolest, best way to do that, so what we're going to do is kind of isolate these together. So I'm going to cut in front of the snap for both of them. And let's actually move this down because what we're going to do is add some reverb. So if I add reverb and the clip stops here, suddenly the reverb is going to drop out. So I want to extend these as much as possible. And what I'm going to do is, because I'm putting a volume down 2 keyframes on this clip, if I add reverb, it's suddenly going to drop right here. So the way around that, which we visited earlier in the course, is to nest the sequence. On the second clip, I don't really need to because we have the sound at the very beginning that we want to add reverb to. And for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to do the same thing to this clip. Bada boom. And now what I'm going to do is go to Effects, type in Reverb, drag the reverb onto this clip. I'm going to hit edit. I'm going to go to, you can experiment with any of your reverb filters that your software has. There's going to be tons of different presets you can do. Honestly, I legit always go for the Great Hall preset. I don't know why. The other ones, they don't really do it for me. So I really urge you to experiment and find which kind of reverb you like. So I'm going to open up this room size. The room size is basically smaller room, less reverb, larger room, more reverb. So I open that up all the way. I'm going to turn down the dampening and the diffusion. You don't need to get too complex with it, but the higher the dampening and the higher the diffusion, the faster that the reverb gets dampened and taken away. We're going to turn our dry all the way up and our wet all the way up. Dry means the sound of the audio without the effect, and the wet means the audio without the previous sound. That's hard to explain. So I'm just going to put the wet all the way down, play it. That's the original. And then I'm going to put the wet all the way up and the dry all the way down, and I'm going to solo it. So you can hear the effect that we're adding is that in the background, okay? So we're going to put them both all the way up. That means the original sound, the dry sound, is going to be 100% playing, and the new filtered sound, which is the wet sound, is going to be 100% playing as well. Let's see how it sounds. Like this, and made it look like this. Okay, that's pretty good. So I'm going to copy this filter. We don't need to fine tune it a whole lot. So I'm going to paste it on our second snap. Okay, so this one could use a little bit more. So I'm going to turn up the decay. The decay is how long the effect is sustained. The longer the decay, the longer the shorter the decay. You know, when someone decays, it goes away, right? So if we extend that decay, it stays for longer. So, okay, so let's take a listen. Studio space like this, and made it look like this. And let's hear it without. This, and made it look like this. And with this, and made it look like this. Yep. So a really cool little effect that you can add there that just works in some scenarios. Just adding a little bit of reverb. You know, this is a before and after shot, so adding reverb to anything makes it sound a little bit more epic. With vocals, it doesn't work very well, but with sound effects and with hits or impacts in your video, reverb is a really cool way. Now, one final thing I want to say before we move to the next lesson is I initially thought we were going to change the pitch of one of these clips if we take a listen. But they already have a different pitch. This one's lower and this one's higher. Which it's kind of cool to, when you have two different sound effects that are similar. What I generally do, for some reason, these are different pitches because I guess I snapped slightly different in real life when I recorded this. But let's say that that wasn't the case. What I would do would be to highlight one of these clips where we wanted to slightly change the pitch. I'm going to right click it. I'm going to go to speed duration, and I can slow it down or speed it up like 10 or 20%. If I speed it up to, let's say, 120, now it's going to be a lot more high pitch, right? If I did the opposite, where I slowed it down from 100% to 80%, it has a different kind of hit, right? It feels different. And made it look like this. So that sounds and looks great. It really makes this after shot really kind of stand out more. So that's a really cool tip you can do. You can add reverb to sound effects in the background, and you can change the speed, which inherently or in turn is going to change the pitch.